we are anticipating Rosh Hashanah, and then 10 days later, Yom Kippur. Hi, Marcia.
Hi.
What we wanted to do, and I'll try to do this in approximately an hour, and then leave some time at the end for questions. If they're technical questions, I may have to hand them over to Ruth Ann or something else about how to get online or what you're going to see, what you're not going to see, things like that. If they're thematic questions or content questions about the holidays and the Machzor, the prayer book, then I'll try to answer those. But because it's new for all of us, this is our Machzor. A Siddur is a daily or a weekly Shabbat and festivals prayer book, but a Machzor is the special name for a High Holy Day prayer book, or as we were saying last week, rather than High Holy Days, they're the days of awe, the days of repentance. Richard Levy or Levy, depending on whether you knew him or whether you didn't know him, and how you pronounced his last name. Richard Levy was unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Very, very well respected and well liked. He was a real mensch, but a very well respected scholar. He was the Hillel director. You know, Hillel is the campus organization, college campuses for Jewish students. And he was the Hillel director at UCLA for many, many years. And then he also taught at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, their Los Angeles branch. He wrote liturgy, he wrote poetry. He, like me, was fascinated by the Midrash literature. But I was fortunate to serve on a few committees and boards with him through the years. He really was, in addition to being a respected scholar, really was a mensch. So it's meaningful for me to be able to use his prayer book here, his Machzor for the holy days for us. When he edited, and this is the second edition, a more modern edition of the first interpretation that he provided. He said that because it's for Hillel, and it makes sense for a community like ours as well, he wanted the prayer book to be inclusive and respectful of the diversity of various Jewish movements in North America, but also, and to affirm the common, this is his phrase, to affirm the common strands of faith in all of our divergences. So he wanted to respect the differences that those of us who come from Reform or Conservative or Orthodox or Reconstructionist or Renewal or whatever it might be. And he also was recognizing that a good percentage of those college students who came to the services, on the one hand, there were those who came just for the socialization, and it's early enough in the academic year that they were coming to see who else was Jewish, or to maybe make new friends or whatever it might be. And he was also very aware, and I remember him giving a presentation about this, that he said probably as much as 40% of his students, so meaning 40% of the congregation at any one year, this was their first High Holy Day experience outside of their home congregations. So everyone was used to the patterns and the traditions and the customs from their home synagogue, and the melodies and what would happen and who would do what, and all the little shtick that each individual synagogue or congregation around the country might have. Now all of a sudden these students are finding themselves, well, some would go home for the weekend if they could, or go home for the holiday, but many, this was their first experience in in a pluralistic kind of synagogue, or just a synagogue that was different from their home congregation. So he had to realize all that. His comments that, so again, what that means is that he in choreographing or in laying out the service, there would be a lot of opportunity for people to meet each other, for them to actually verbalize their reactions or their responses to different things that were happening in the service, to ask questions, and things that we won't be able to do this year at least, but maybe that's a pattern we might want to consider somehow, with open invitation for discussion rather than just reading out of the prayer book. In the introduction, if you have the book there, in the introduction, beginning on pages, it's in the first couple. They use Roman numerals. So XXVII is when he begins with some comments on how to use the Machzor, and I'm going to summarize some of those and point out what's going to happen with ours. Some things that we want to highlight, some things that we're going to attempt to include in our worship. And again, this is an experience and an experiment in process. Ruth Ann and I fondly say, and we'll do a lot of evaluating, and we will appreciate the feedback. But after Rosh Hashanah, so that if we have to make some changes in the way we do things in time for Yom Kippur, we'll put in that hard work as well. So Richard Levy's comments include the fact that some of what we will encounter is new, is creative. Some of it, the Hebrew will sound familiar, but he has new translations or new interpretations. And again, as I just mentioned a moment ago, some of the choreography would be different. Levy was known frequently for conducting his services in the round. He felt that it was much more appropriate for people to be able to look at each other rather than focusing specifically on the bima, on the ark, where the Torah scrolls are kept. And he made some kind of a joke again in this one presentation that I remember hearing him do. He said he had to be respectful of the fact that a lot of the, and excuse the fact that I'm referring to them this way, a lot of the boys and girls were coming to services to see the other boys and girls. Rather, that was more important than actually listening to me as the rabbi or listening to the Torah. So he preferred to have his services done with a choreography and a seating assignment, where he could orchestrate everyone could see each other rather than focusing and only looking directly at him. He points out in those early pages about how to use the Machzor. He points out that there are some phrases that may be unfamiliar to people. Now, again, given the fact that we have been using the Reform Friday night prayer book, the Reform Siddur Friday night and Saturday morning, so you're aware, those of you who come from a more traditional background are aware that there are some minor changes. They may be major philosophical changes or theological changes, but the actual change that we encounter in the wording is minor. So, for example, we in the Reform Prayer Book, and it's an option in this Machzor, is in the Avot Ivahot prayer. The Avot prayer is to pray to Melech Goel as Geula versus Goel. Goel is a redeemer. It's one of the synonyms for the Messiah. whereas the liberal community reform, conservative reconstructionist talk more these days in terms of Geulah, which is redemption or a messianic era, rather than talking about a goel, about one individual who will be the redeemer. Similarly, there's a minor change. Again, it may have major theological impact, but there's a minor change in the Hebrew in the second paragraph of the Tefillah, where it says Mechaye. We now say Mechaye Hakol Berachamim Rabim. We praise God who gives life to all or to everything, rather than Mechaye HaMetim, which was that God gives life to the dead, which was understood as resurrecting the dead. Again, we're not going to go into the theological ramifications of the difference. So there are some of those minor differences in the Ritzei prayer, which comes several pages after the examples I was just using. There are some phrases that are missing. They exist in the traditional prayer book, whether it's the daily prayer book or the High Holy Day prayer book, that talk about restoring the sacrifices and the temple cult, and restoring the temple in Jerusalem, and praying for the day when the descendant of King David will again rule over the Jewish world, etc. Those are still there in the traditional prayer book. Whether the daveners, those who are praying with the book, whether they believe that or not, or whether they really are hoping for the restoration of the temple cult, of the sacrifices, but the words are still there. In the more liberal prayer book, the phrases, and there are two or three, have been taken out. In this prayer book, in the Machzor, the Mishaberach prayer, the prayer for healing, that we include in almost all of our services, and we include it as part of the Torah service, usually between Torah and Haftarah or something like that. In some of his services, they will appear, because if there's no Torah reading or no Torah, the particular Torah reading ritual, then he'll include the Mishaberach, a healing prayer, again, now several pages or paragraphs after the Ritzei that I was just talking about before, in the restoration of the cult. What we're going to be doing, just to clue you in, is we'll include a Mishaberach, a healing prayer, in each of our services, but we'll only read the names officially, the Mishaberach list, on the mornings when we have the Torah service. We'll still include the prayer and a moment for people to think of, or if they want to publicly announce a name in their family, that'll be fine. Same thing with Yizkor and with Mourner's Kaddish. The Yizkor service is a separate liturgy. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. That comes on Yom Kippur, but in every one of the services except Yom Kippur morning, there's still the mourner's Kaddish. We will include the weekly Kaddish list on Rosh Hashanah, on the evening service on Friday night and on Saturday morning. But on Yom Kippur, the tradition is, unless Yom Kippur happens to be on Friday night or Saturday, which it's not this year, but on Yom Kippur, we will just be using the list of those who have died in the last year since Yom Kippur of the year before. And again, there'll be a moment of silence if anyone and everyone who wishes to mention a name privately or out loud, even if they're in their own home, that's fine. Now, what I would like to propose, and I'm going to just take advantage of the fact that there are the 8, 9 of you here. I started a custom back in Michigan that people found to be very meaningful. I find it especially meaningful that almost immediately after we've said the list at Yiskor, almost immediately after we've said the list of those who have died in our extended families and in our community and congregation in the last year, we also asked for people to announce the name of any newborns or newly adopted into their families. And so not only are we mourning, but we're also celebrating those who are coming in. So I'm going to be saying we don't have to prepare anything in advance, but I'm just cluing you in, unless somebody has a major objection for some reason that I've never encountered before over the last 25 years. But then again, you never know. But after the memorial list on Yom Kippur, I will ask for anybody to publicly just say the name of a new baby or a new a grandchild or a great grandchild, or could be a nephew or a niece or whatever it might be, whether it has been born or adopted into our families. Now we can't really share and hear all of those names, but we'll wait for 5-6 seconds and allow people to say all the names, and then everybody will all say a big mazel tov, together. So that's something that I really hope to be able to do, and hope that you'll find it a meaningful thing as well. That not only do we acknowledge and mourn those who we've lost, but we celebrate with a big mazel tov of those who are joining us in the world as well. Rabbi Levy does provide different texts and different questions and opportunities for study sessions on Yom Kippur afternoon. We will be doing the same between the time of our Yiskor service, when it's provided, and then late in the afternoon. But there will be study opportunities or discussion opportunities, Zoom classes kind of format, if you will, including a study of the book of Jonah, which is the traditional Haftarah reading for Yom Kippur. So we'll do that as a study session rather than including that in the morning on Yom Kippur. Also, that will be the time, rather than our reading out loud publicly, the section of the service that's called the Martyrology, that talks about the deaths, the life and death of many of the scholars and sages from 2,000 years ago, and continues on through into the Holocaust, moments of memory. It's a Jewish history lesson. There will be a time when we just encourage people, if they want to read that on their own. It's from pages 498 to 505. So that will be acknowledged, but we're not going to be including it as a formal part of our worship. Last comment about this kind of introduction, if you will, is about music. So the music this year is really going to be a hodgepodge. That's the technical term, hodgepodge, as opposed to a mishmash. Mishmash might be for every day and Shabbos, but on high holy days, it's a hodgepodge. So there will be some quote unquote traditional melodies, what's called nusach. There are some melodies that immediately, when you hear them, you'll be able to hum along, even if you're not familiar with necessarily with using the words of the liturgy to those melodies, but they are specifically known as and specifically used only on high holy days or in preparation for the High Holy Days. A couple examples. There's one that we use. We do with Mi Chamocha. Da 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 da. There's that one. There's Avinu Malkeinu. Avinu Malkeinu. Da 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 da. Da, 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 da. So there are a number of different melodies that will be used for some of the prayers. May catch you a little bit by surprise of when we use it, but again, it'll be something that you can hum along to or certainly follow along with the words. Because Rosh Hashanah is Shabbat, there will be some of the melodies that we've been using for our regular several times a month, our Friday night and Saturday morning services. Some of you know that we've made arrangements with Cantor Ross Woolman from Temple Chai in Phoenix, that he came down and he stood on our bima and we recorded him singing some of the major cantorial liturgical pieces, Kol Nidre and Unatana Tokef, and the Yizkor prayers. So he recorded those for us, as well as one or two other pieces that we'll use in each of the services to add that particular tradition, because I don't consider myself of having that kind of a cantorial soloist voice, nor do I have the background to be able to provide that for us. We've also chosen a few YouTube videos that Ruth Ann, in her expertise, can now weave in for us, and I did that specifically for us to remind ourselves that even though we may feel totally isolated here in Green Valley, we are connected to Jews all over the world. So what I've tried to do is find some YouTube examples of both melodies and prayers that reflect the different Sephardic communities, or something that came from Jerusalem, or that's something that came from Johannesburg, or something that might have come from London or other areas. There from Morocco, I remember that there's something that you will see. So both for our generational as well as our geographical connections on the High Holy Days, that we are part of Am Yisrael, we are part of a larger Jewish people, and we're all praying together, even if it may be in different languages or with different melodies and at different moments during Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There will also be one or two moments that I beg your indulgence. This is the first time that I've been able to spend the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, with you, and I have my own, after 47 years of conducting services and serving as a rabbi in various communities, I have my own little idiosyncratic minhagim, customs, for the way that I approach the holy days. And I will be sharing some of them, not all of them, but some of them over the course of the services in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. One example in the story behind it, and I'll tell the story for everyone again on Rosh Hashanah. There's a central part of our service, a set of about I think it runs about 3 pages in the Machzor, about 6 or 7 paragraphs. There's a section of the service that's known as the Uvachein prayer. There are a number of different interpretations and background stories of the Uvachein prayer, but the one that I'm going to be imposing on you is the fact that my uncle of blessed memory, after whom I'm named, was a cantor. He was killed in World War II. He was killed at Normandy, not on D-Day, but later in the summer after D-Day. He was killed at Normandy just a few years before I was born, so I was named after him. But he was a cantor, and he had his own melody for the Uvechein prayer that he would chant every year on the High Holy Days. And it was one of those simple melodies that everyone in the community, this happened to be in Cleveland, everyone in the community identified with Cantor Norman Roman. Since I have started, or since 45 years ago, 47 years ago, since I started conducting services, whenever I could, I would still use that melody in his memory. So it may be a melody that you might have heard, you might not have heard. It's a melody that you'll kind of be able to pick up again and along, again, hum along if you'd like, rather than trying to fit all the Hebrew words together there. But it's a very meaningful thing for me to connect historically with my family and to honor the memory of my late uncle in that sense. So there'll be a couple of those little idiosyncratic things that I'll be sharing, some little stories, whether they're personal stories, whether they're informative, educational, as we get to certain parts of the service, if you will. We have encountered an interesting, not a dilemma, but a situation this year, because as happens, like I think 3 times out of every 9, if I remember the formula exactly, Rosh Hashanah this year is on Friday night and Saturday. And those who come from a traditional orientation know that with 2 very important parts of the liturgy and of the service and of the symbolism, if the holy day occurs on Shabbat, you postpone it for the extra day. Now, remember that traditional communities have the extra day, a second day of Rosh Hashanah. Whereas Reform and Reconstructionists, for example, frequently do not, or there may be a community service rather than each individual synagogue having a service. So 2 things that affect us. One is the reciting and chanting of the Avinu Malkeinu prayer. The reason that's not used on Shabbat is because it's basically a list of petitions, of requests, and they're personal requests, and those have historically, in the liturgy on a typical Shabbat, we historically don't use petitionary prayers on Shabbat. They're deferred back to the weekday. So Avinu Malkeinu, in a traditional sense, is not recited when Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur is on a Friday night or Saturday. So what we are doing is we will have a recording of Avinu Malkeinu, both the reading and the chanting, for those who wish to see it and view it and share with it on Friday night or Saturday. You're welcome to do that. For those who wish to defer it until Sunday morning, you're welcome to watch it whenever you would like to do that. Same for the shofar service. Now, the problem with a shofar on Saturday morning is not so much for Mike Finkelstein to be sounding the shofar, blowing the shofar. That's okay. That's a mitzvah. The mitzvah is for all of us to hear the shofar, and it's a double mitzvah for the one who does the sounding of it. But the prohibition of doing shofar on Saturday is so that you don't inadvertently carry the shofar, because carrying things on Shabbat is forbidden. So the shofar service, in a traditional sense, is deferred until the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And again, what we have done is we have recorded the shofar service, and it will be available and as a separate YouTube, I guess, yeah, a separate recording. And if you wish to watch it and hear the shofar on Saturday morning after our communal service is finished. All you have to do is click on that link and you'll be able to see the shofar. You'll be able to hear the shofar. You'll be able to do it either before or after Avinu Malkeinu, however you want. And if you would rather wait until Sunday, because that's your tradition, then you can wait and do that on Sunday, whether you listen to the entire morning service again, or whether you just do Avinu Malkeinu and shofar on Sunday morning. That's an option for everyone. Okay. Let's look at the Machzor, look at the prayer book for a few moments. And I guess if you've got one there in front of you, beginning on page 25, I'll just show you how the book is oriented and laid out and printed, because it's different than the prayer book that we've been using on Friday night and Saturday morning. And it's different than the Machzor that Beth Shalom Temple Center has been using for the last several years. Hopefully the pages won't fall apart, right? And the pages won't fall out. They better not. They better not. So we're at the part of the service. It's called Geula, the redemption prayer that comes right after the V'ahavta, and beginning on page 25. So what he's done here is he has the traditional Hebrew text. He also has all of the Hebrew throughout the entire book is available there right next to it, line by line, as what's called transliteration, as it's provided in English letters. I find it very disorienting to try to read the Hebrew words with English letters, but many people who are not familiar with the Hebrew characters, the Hebrew alphabet, find that they can follow along fairly easily. So everything that's in Hebrew in this prayer book is also available right next to it on the same page in English transliteration. So again, in the way we're doing our services, other than the handful of people who will be in the sanctuary with us, but all the people at home, we won't necessarily know if you're reading along or not reading along, but you are certainly welcome to. It's not like I'm going to be able to say, and now we will all continue reading together on page 25 or page 26. If you want to read along, you are welcome to. So page 25, that prayer continues on to the top of page 26 with the Hebrew and the transliteration. And the Hebrew prayer, the traditional wording in Hebrew characters as well as English characters. Then what follows at the bottom of page 26 and goes on to page 27 is the first of two interpretations of the Hebrew. The first one, that's 26 and 27, the first one is, in Rabbi Levi's terms, is faithful to the meaning. It's not an exact translation, and this happens to be structured as a responsive reading, but again, we won't necessarily know if people are reading responsively or antiphonally, or whichever way it might be. So we'll be reading the whole thing, but it is faithful to the traditional text. It's not a word for word translation. It includes interpretation, or as some of us have been studying for the last couple of weeks or longer, it includes commentaries or midrash, if you will. Then beginning on 27 and on through the top of 29, that's a much more contemporary interpretation, or as he calls it, a variation on the theme of the prayer. You wouldn't be able to try to find connection between the Hebrew words and the English words that are on 27 to 29, but the theme is the same. So if the theme is redemption of our people, which in the original Hebrew takes us back to Egypt and being redeemed out of Egypt, here 27 to 29, he talks about a more contemporary understanding of the idea of redemption. Then in the middle of 29 and continuing then on to the top of page 30, our familiar Mi Chamocha. Marcia, you're raising your hand? You're muted.
Okay, now a group of us at La Posada are
Right,
going to be together. Now,
right.
are you going to read the first one that we can follow you, or are you going to read the second one, or what?
You mean like on that responsive reading, on those pages for the responsive
Yes.
reading? I'll
Yeah.
probably be reading both, but
Oh,
you're welcome to treat it as a responsive reading. But I'll
okay.
probably read both because we won't know. It's not like those of you at La Posada or any of you in your own homes it's not
At
like we'll have a
home,
microphone
right.
that we would
There'll
hear.
be a lot of people at home, right.
Right, right.
Okay,
So
thank you.
you're welcome to. Right.
Thank you.
Okay. So then on page 29, again, you'll see there's the traditional Mi Chamocha, but again, the melody will be the High Holiday melody. Mi Chamocha ba 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 da da dum, bum 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 ba dum bum ba da dum. Okay, but there they have the transliteration as well as the translation is blended right in there uh, for you there also. Okay, so that's just that's a sample of the way that we'll be approaching the typical pages on the book, because we're trying to be um, cognizant of time frame. There'll be a lot of skipping. There'll be a lot of times that I will say, and now I invite you to continue for the next 3-4 pages on your own, silently, privately. What I am going to suggest to people is that you may want to have a bunch of like little post-it notes or little stickers that if we move a little too quickly over a section of the service that has been especially Gary Scott, little sticker kind of things that that you can pop in there, and that you're going to want to come back to page 28 because that's a theme or that's a prayer that has been especially meaningful for you. And Rabbi Roman skipped it, but so I want to make sure that I go back to it if it's something that you know that you are missing, and you certainly have my permission as well as my encouragement to do it that way. Okay, so the page numbers aside, the structure of the service, no matter which prayer book we're using, but the structure of the service for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, evening and morning services, is basically the same. There are introductory prayers, there are welcoming prayers, if you will. We get into the section, and technically the word is a rubric, the rubric of the service that goes around the Shema, the reciting of the Shema. It starts with Baruch Hu and goes through the Mi Chamocha that we were just talking about. It's called Shema and its blessings. That's in every evening service, in every morning service. Some of that will be musical, some of that will be singing along, some of that will just be proclaiming. Some people have their own particular customs and choreography. Some people cover their eyes for those parts of the service. Some people like to be standing. Some people like to be prefer to be sitting. There's one tradition that because this is such an important part of the service, you shouldn't change your posture. So wherever you are when you get to this part of the service, you should stay that way for the next 5-6 days, so that you're not disrupting either yourself or disorienting yourself, or that you're not creating disruption to the person sitting or standing next to you. The central part of the service is called the Tefillah. Some people know it as the Shemona Esrei, or as the Amidah, or the standing prayer. It's an abbreviated, not Reader's Digest condensed version in an abbreviated sense, but it's abbreviated on a festival or on a holy day rather than the daily prayer. The daily prayers have 19 paragraphs, but on the holy day there are much fewer. It seems longer because there are these additions, like the one I was talking about before, the Uvachain prayer that comes in there. There are times for private prayer. Sometimes we refer that as silent prayer, and especially on Yom Kippur. That's where we include frequently the sections of the service that are called vidui, the confessional, time for private, time for public, time for confessing those sins and misdeeds that we recall from the past year, and that are in the singular as well as those that are in the plural. So you might remember, I'm just giving you a little bit of a foretaste or whatever. There's a part of the service that includes an alphabetical, in Hebrew, an alphabetical listing of all the sins. Now, that's not that you or I, of course we know each other very well, that you or I have committed all these sins, an entire alphabet worth, but out of all of us and our community and our loved ones, someone may have committed that, but we take on ourselves a responsibility for not having called them out on that, for not having asked them or suggested that they perform teshuvah, that they repent for it, and they change their behavior because of it. So there's this alphabetical listing of all the prayers. Some people even have a custom of beating their chest with each of the words, the way it's pronounced, and we'll do that and offer that as an option. There's the listing of what we call the al chet, for all the sins that we have committed, and then a generic Va'al Kulam, and for all of these things, God, may we be forgiven. Avinu Malkeinu follows those private prayers again, which we talked about, and I'll try to put the Avinu Malkeinu liturgy and the context of it. I'll try to put it into context before we get to that. Concluding prayers, mourner's Kaddish, as it were. The Uvachain is an additional, it gets an additional in there. Several times we encountered the phrase of Zachrenu l'chaim, may we be remembered for life. That's a reminiscent of the image we talked about last week, the Sefer HaChaim, the book of life. That may we be written, may we be inscribed, then may we be sealed for a good year in the book of life. Speaking of Avinu Malkeinu, originally that was only the last line. That's the last line that all of us sing together. The last line was attributed that it's almost 2,000 years old. It's attributed to Rabbi Akiva in the 2nd century of the Common Era. But as we went through the 2,000 years, different places, different communities, different rabbis, different teachers, different liturgists, the list gets longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. Most of the prayer books that we encounter today, in the list of requests, Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, or however it might be translated, grant us a good year, grant us a year of health, grant us a year of prosperity, grant us this, grant us that, all these petitionary statements that we mentioned before. In the 1950s, some of us will remember, in the 1950s, a composer we'll be using some of his music on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, a composer by the name of Max Janowski in Chicago, wrote a big, very powerful interpretation of Avinu Malkeinu, rather than the traditional melody that we kind of that recurs over and over again. Da 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 Avinu Malkeinu. There's that one. But Janowski wrote a major piece that became as familiar, I guess, in our day would be as Debbie Friedman's Misha Berach. Everybody seems to know, and everybody seemed to be using, as of the late 1950s, Max Janowski's version of Avinu Malkeinu, which meant that it was written with one particular list of the Avinu Malkeinu petitions, the Avinu Malkeinu requests. And so, because everybody would sing it, all the synagogues, all the temples, whether it was a cantor, whether it was a choir, whatever, everybody would sing the list as it was in the way that he wrote or composed that musical arrangement. So we will probably encounter that when Cantor Wollman sings that Janowski version of the Avinu Malkeinu, the words may be in a different order than they are in the Machzor, in the prayer book. There may be additional phrases that are in the book that he's not singing. There may be things that he's singing that are actually near the end of the list, but he's singing them at the beginning of the list because he's singing it the way that Janowski wrote it in the late, like I say, in the late 1950s. That's kind of a unique thing to the North American Jewish community, if you will. So the evening and the morning services on Yom Kippur include, like I said, include this vidui, include the confessional opportunity, and then we get to after there's no concluding mourner's Kaddish on Yom Kippur morning. What we'll do at that point, so we figured it's going to be somewhere in the 12:15 range, something like that. We will take a break for 10-15 minutes. It's not a lunch break, it's a potty break, but it's not a lunch break. And we will then we'll do the Yizkor service. Some people are more comfortable with doing Yizkor at the very end of the day, later in the afternoon on Yom Kippur, but the more traditional time is right after the morning service. So that's what we're going to do. We'll take a little break, and that's when we'll do the Yizkor service. But again, if somebody again, it will be recorded, and if someone wants to see it later in the afternoon, they can watch it later in the afternoon rather than at the point where we're talking about. Traditionally, historically, there are two other services on Yom Kippur afternoon that we're going to kind of modify. One is the Musaf service, also known as the Avodah service or the additional service, and it basically teaches and reviews the Yom Kippur ritual as it happened, as it occurred, with the high priest entering the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem, the one time of year that he would do that, pronounce God's name, and ask God to forgive the sins, forgive his sins, forgive the sins of his family, and then forgive the sins of all the people of Israel. There was a ceremony that is the origin of the term scapegoat, where a goat was actually not sacrificed necessarily, but was thrown out of the gates down outside the city, and there was a ritual of all the sins of the people were placed on the horns of the scapegoat, who was then exiled, if you will. So there's the Musaf additional service included a review of all of those rituals and practices certainly for hundreds of years, there was the hope and the prayer that once again God would allow us to return to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and reinstitute all those practices. But nowadays, that's not really the prayer. But in many congregations and many communities, they still do provide the opportunity for studying, for teaching about what those rituals were in the olden days, the ancient days, if you will. There's also the Mincha service, the Yom Kippur afternoon service, that doesn't start with the Shema and its blessings. It starts immediately with the tefillah, with the Avot Imahot, the Shemona Esrei, if you know it that way. It includes a Torah reading. That's my favorite Torah reading. That's the Holiness Code, the Leviticus 19, and the Haftarah normally that would be read at that time is the book of Jonah, which we're going to include as a study opportunity earlier in the afternoon. And even though I suggested it, I guess the board doesn't want to do it. The ancient tradition that whoever was was invited to have the honor of reading the book of Jonah on Yom Kippur to the whole congregation, the expectation was that he or she would make a major donation to the building fund. Now, again, I guess the board at BSTC decided not to do it that way, so I'll be reading Jonah without making the donation. All right, okay. Anyway, then the final service in more ways than Grace gave me a thumbs up. Thanks. Okay. All right. The final portion, the last had 20 minutes to a half hour, as it were, on Yom Kippur that takes us up to sunset is called Ne'ilah. Now, Ne'ilah is a Hebrew word that basically means locking. Remember, so that we started Rosh Hashanah with this notion or the imagery of the gates of prayer and the gates of repentance that are opening for the 10 days. And now they are slowly closing as darkness descends upon us on Yom Kippur. And Nila really means that that's the moment when they're closed and sealed and locked, although they're still open enough. In the old days, it wasn't locked entirely. There was still, room to be able to slide, whether it's a little petach, a little note or whatever it is, or your hand or something. So the image is that the doors are locked, hence the name Nila, but the teaching is that the gates of prayer, the gates of repentance are always open to those who have the correct intention in their heart and in their soul. So there are several prayers that talk as a final way of asking for God's forgiveness, that we have participated in this Yom Tzom, this fast day, this day of self-denial, and that we hope that we are, even though we may feel weak in our bodies, but that our souls are strong enough to encounter the next year and that which will come about. The ceremony of Havdalah that marks the end of Yom Kippur, the distinction, the separation between holy and profane, because Yom Kippur is not only a Shabbat, it's Shabbat Shabbaton. It's the Sabbath of Sabbaths. It's the Sabbath par excellence. And we go from not only from the end of this particular Sabbath into the regular weekday, but we mark the end of the period of 10 days and pray for the year to come. So normally on a Havdalah, we end by saying Shavua Tov, may you have a good week. Now we say Shana Tova, may you have a good year, in that sense. And then, of course, what everybody waits for is Tekiah Gedola, is a final blast of the shofar that should come right about at at sunset, and then in one way or another, people break the fast. And my suggestion is don't try to do that with a big heavy meal. Just do it maybe with a little bit of schnapps, a little bit of wine, and just a little something to eat. So there's my discussion or preparation through with the Mahzor, and with some thoughts about how we're going to prepare and how we hopefully will present the worship services this year. It is going to be different. I was on the phone this morning with two of my colleagues around the country, and everyone is preparing a little bit differently without really knowing what things are going to look like. Both from our standpoint of standing on the bima, usually Grace just sent me a thing. Can we have absolutely, you can have apples dipped in honey. Absolutely. What it's going to be like for those of us who are used to conducting High Holy Day services to hundreds, if not thousands, of worshipers in the room, and now it's going to be a handful. One camera, two cameras, and things like that. So it is going to be different, and we appreciate the patience and the cooperation and the understanding that everyone's going to have for us. And again, it's my opportunity to say a big thank you to Ruth Ann and to Michael and Mike and everybody who has been helping out in getting all this set up. So with that in mind, got a couple minutes if you have questions.